thank you for coming tonight. As we've said before, this is an online seminar, a challenge seminar with our guest presenters. And of course, it's important that we do this. I think it also provides a resource for our web facility for further viewing and further research activities afterwards. And so I'm pleased that we can do that. I'm pleased to welcome our two presenters tonight. Clifford Spencer, I've met him very few times, but has been a stalwart supporter and a trustee of our United Nations Greater Lincolnshire. He's a man that is in values and in commitment and ambition, a man that I admire and has been a great encourager for us. Andrew, I've not met, but I'm pleased to say that he has a glittering career in agricultural biology and botany, plant breeding, a keen interest in locality solutions, as well as farm to food and consumers. And of course, tonight about biodiversity, we are very topical with both the news in the wider world, but of course in our locality. I was struck by a man I walked with during COVID lockdown who was an agronomist in my village. And I asked this man while we were walking past some fields near where I live, how long do you think you have known as an agronomist that all the things you did in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s in your lifetime about what was happening to the land and produce? He said, we knew about things then, but he said our mission, our ambition was about food supply and security of food supply. So the targets that we were required to meet were perhaps the right ones for them at that time, but of course they leave a residue of issues that we're dealing with now. And I'm pleased tonight we're looking at this issue of biodiversity and issues around the future and our future view. So I please hand over to Clifford and then on to Andrew for our presentation. Thank you.
To give you a little bit of background to both me and Andrew, my background is muddy boots farming, and as Clive alluded to, from being a very young boy sat on the farm, I became increasingly aware that things weren't as they should be. And I think that provided the stimulation in later life to become interested, particularly in biotechnology. And although it's a sort of a fancy title, really what it's talking about is technical biology. In other words, just understanding how things live and move. So it's not about the GM and all the things that people associate the name with, but with things like bread making and beer making and all this kind of thing, natural processes. The foundation has been in existence for about a decade. Next slide. And what our mission is to produce the awareness for the potential of this technical biology to support sustainability, basically, the thing that's become the in word now increasingly as time goes on. Next slide. And what we're trying to do is look at us weaning us off fossil fuel based development and put it on to bio-based, the so-called bioeconomy or the circular economy. And we're trying to encourage this in a number of different ways. Next slide. We were very fortunate in that a number of years ago, after giving a talk, the United Nations Foundation, which is an organization formed to bring all the different United Nations organizations together, took an interest in us and what we were doing. And they said they would support us in putting the organization together and building a global network. And that's what's been happening over the last few years. The organization's headquartered in Leeds, although it's practically run out of Lincolnshire now, in fact, from the Europark in Grimsby. So the United Nations Association for Greater Lincolnshire will have an intimate connection with what we're doing as we move forward. Next slide. what we will benefit from, and hopefully what the United Nations Association of Greater Lincolnshire will benefit from, is the fact we have a direct linkage with all the UN organisations, and we operate at national government level, and we're lucky to be graced with several major philanthropists. So as all of this work moves forward, hopefully there will be some big opportunities for this region to become involved. Next slide. In terms of just the general big picture of what's been going on the planet, and I was made very aware of just how things have changed in my lifetime looking at crops, because most of us get our sustenance now from just 3 crops globally. An astonishing figure when you consider how much that's changed from when I was a small boy. But as you can see from this slide, 3/4 of the land surface of the earth has been affected by our activity. That's not to even mention what we've been doing to the oceans. We've got 1 million plants at risk of extinction, and we've wiped out about 2/3 of all global wildlife since I met my good lady wife, and we've just been married for half a century. So I wouldn't blame our marriage for the course of this, but it's a side-by-side event. So we need to look after what's left. And as the comment there is, 2% of global wildlife is now rapidly disappearing. We seem as a race to be systematically destructive. So we need to really think hard about what we're doing. And this is something to which Andrew will allude to in the bulk of this presentation. We've separated ourselves from nature. We've said that we are something different rather than the fact we're actually integrated into it. So what Andrew's presentation will be all about is this 60% of biodiversity that we've lost in this country and elsewhere. Next slide. And just to give a breakdown of what's happened, and this in the case of agricultural livestock, of all the mammals on the planet, we're about just over 1/3. Nearly 2/3 is domesticated animals, the animals I've looked after for most of my life, and wildlife is now restricted to just 4%. It's just an astonishing figure for how quickly these things have changed. Next slide. And this takes us on to Dr. Ormerod's part of the presentation. So handing over to you, Andrew.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to take you for a little tour through history of how we become separated from nature. And then we're going to look at, because my background is in crops, about food crops and biodiversity. And then we're going to look at how we can reconnect the ecology, food production and livelihoods at the end. So humans originally were hunter-gatherers and were in tune for survival for food production with the seasons and with natural cycles. They controlled their family size because they were on the move. But they had some extra skills, such as being able to clear land with fire, and also by hunting. And it appears about 11,000 years ago that various probably climatic events and food shortages started to cause land clearing and settling down, a change actually towards farming. But I would stress that it's actually the clearing and the sowing of the seeds may have been going on for some time. But anyway, what happened was our settlement actually caused a revolution in the end. And we were able also to domesticate animals to meet our food shortages at the time. And that was possibly due also, as we became settled, larger families were possible. So settlements were established, and it took time for hierarchies to develop, and eventually for civilization to develop. A civilization really means the building of cities and walls and religious institutions to start and manufacturing to happen. But one of the things that happened was also the development of philosophy. And part of the philosophy, actually, from ancient Greek times onwards, was sort of separating humans from nature, putting us apart. And this actually continued on for some time, until really recently, actually, until people have started to consider how to reconnect, production, food production, and ecology and livelihoods again. So there were some missed opportunities. There's this perception of the wild being separate. Early on, in when the conquistadors arrived in South America, one of the earliest expeditions down the Amazon actually discovered cities in the forest, which appeared to be more in tune with their environment. But when people went down subsequently, they couldn't find any remains of this. The forest was just obviously with hunter-gatherer communities, but it had just gone back to wild. And it's only in the 20th century, with archaeology and discovery of biochar, that we've been able to verify these early findings. But what happened was that this influence of the separation of human activity from the wild and ecology influenced things like the establishment of parks in America. So John Muir, who was actually from Scotland originally, was influential in setting up parks in the USA. And what happened was that local communities who were involved in the forest were actually banished from them. So they're sort of rather sterile. And it's an early example of land sparing, I suppose, when you're looking onto a landscape, but there's no involvement of human activity there. So the problem is that we are so disconnected, and there is such a danger that we are exploiting resources. Some of it is illegal. You might have heard last week about the vaquita, which is the porpoise off Mexico, which is being illegally hunted for Chinese medicine, as a bycatch for a fish that is also endangered, which is being hunted for its swim bladder. And the people involved in it are getting really little. They're just surviving because of the money. But there are other issues here, which are undersea vents, which are rich in minerals, and places like Greenland, where for our eco lifestyle and more sustainable driving habits, etc., rare earth metals are required. So the problem is our requirements for this, where otherwise we're reliant on, for example, China, are actually in conflict with, in some cases, biodiversity in the sea and on the land. And well, going back to the whole issue of landscapes and traditional habitation, a friend of mine, Dario Novellino, who's an anthropologist, is involved with the Batak in Palawan. Their livelihoods at risk because of prospecting for, I think it's chrome mining. They don't, rather like our early hunter-gatherers, they have no concept of land ownership. So one of the issues is with farming, etc., ownership becomes, and stewardship becomes a really important factor in that. So there's all sorts of things going on which are completely out of their control, actually. There are other things obviously being exploited, and one of them is obviously plants and other forms of life for medicine, which is vital, really. At the basis of a lot of medical cures are still plants and other organisms. What's happened is that in many parts of the world, people have become suspicious, so they're unlikely to help because they're not getting the rewards that are needed. And it's also to some degree is the case with crop wild relatives as well. The agreements, international agreements, aren't always working in relation to making wild relatives available. Some countries are actually controlling the sovereignty of their crop wild relatives. So anyway, we're just going to look at biodiversity and development of major and minor crops. There's been concerted efforts with certain crops. Oops, oh, here we go. Which have received undue amount of money and research, really. It has obviously had an enormous impact, and the world relies on 3 caloric staples, particularly wheat, rice and maize, and then to some degree potatoes also are the 4th in that list. So if we go back in time, Thomas Malthus suggested that there would be a collapse of populations because population growth would outstrip the supply of food. However, what happened after the Second World War, when people were concerned about this, was that the technology that supported the Green Revolution and the breeding of wheat and particularly rice, semi-dwarf varieties, happened, and actually it staved off this imminent collapse. And as you can see, the chart on the left is charting the development of the 3 major crops, and potatoes are in light blue down below, which the major crops are keeping up, or were keeping up, with human population growth until about the millennium. On the other side, you've got minor crops like sorghum and millet, and it's just to demonstrate, because of lack of funding, really, they haven't developed to the same degree in terms of human population growth. So if we take some examples of some of the major crops and think about biodiversity. Maize, for example, it sort of fits so many different needs around the world. There is a huge amount of biodiversity in maize. From in Africa, the preference for white maize in southern Africa, which is a historic preference going back to the mid-19th century, actually. And one of the reasons maize took off was the convenience of it for people involved in mining activities, for example. And then on the other side, its role controlled by multinational grain companies in hybrid maize for a whole range of different purposes. But if we go back to the origins of maize, there are some interesting issues in that there's been a long debate about what the original ancestor of maize was. And the most likely one that's been suggested is teosinte, which looks completely different than maize. It's most extraordinary compared to other crops how different it looks. And it's been suggested there have been some major changes, but the evidence hasn't really appeared of a gradual process. But the other thing of interest, actually, is the way that families in Mexico keep their maize going. There's a great deal of pride in what they do. And basically, it's a dynamic process. Sometimes when you get seeded maize, you think it's the same from year to year, they've got the same mixture. But in Mexico, over the millennia, they've always been adding things that they rather desired from their neighbors to their crop, and then reselecting it constantly to meet their needs. And an example of that is in the 2000s, there'd been a change in local maize varieties with longer husks to cover the cob, because an export market had developed to the USA for husks to make tamales, because their children had gone to work in the USA, for example. So it just shows you what can happen. There's all sorts of folklore about the different colours of maize and what they can be used for. In rice, you have a huge range of diversity in Asian rice for different purposes, upland rice and paddy rice and deep water rice. When I started at the Eden Project, the photograph on the right top shows a whole variety of different rice for different purposes, including on the left-hand side front, IR8, which is the first semi-dwarf rice, Green Revolution one, with its two parents, actually a tall one and a short one. And we had deep water rice, which is actually very underdeveloped, actually, in the tubes at the back. And we also featured a new sort of rice, which was basically based on looking at it from an architectural standpoint and having greater photosynthetic penetration of the canopy. But rice, obviously it's grown for different purposes at very high yielding. It tends to have a lot of inputs, but there is a way of producing rice much more sustainably. For example, in Bangladesh, where it's grown with fish, and the fish is as valuable as the rice, which is great because it means that farmers don't use pesticides on it. The fish actually control all the insects in the crop, and they also provide fertilizer for the crop and income for other people involved in the supply chain. So people involved in supplying seed fish, for example. There are major issues, as with the other crops, in terms of climate change, not only with rice being a C3 crop, so actually increased heating may well lead to reduced yields, but also from flooding from seawater. So this is a picture of what might happen in Vietnam by 2050. No, what's likely to happen. And what this means is that they are looking at salinity tolerant rice, but it may mean that they have to do something radical, which is to develop another species from Bangladesh, which is just used for gathering at the moment, but has an ability to withstand salt water as a crop in its own right. On the right-hand bottom, we have got rice in Africa. And it's interesting that in 2004, Monty Jones won the World Food Prize for developing hybrids between Asian African rice to try and boost yields in Africa. Now, African rice itself hasn't been a major crop, but it has been maintained by villages who have selected rice for their own needs for special occasions. So it's been very important in Africa from a cultural standpoint up to now. The interesting thing is Monty Jones's work, which involved hybridization and embryo rescue, and I think it was anticulture actually, that I have learned in the last 2 years that local African tribes have actually noticed hybrids between African and Asian rice in their fields. And I don't know how far this goes back, but they've actually kept the plants, but they haven't had any publicity for this. So moving on. So looking at wheat. So wheat, bread wheat particularly, was actually a chance hybrid between a goat grass and most likely Emma, which is predecessor of durum wheat, basically. And we know where it happened. It happened near the Black Sea. So it was definitely when farming had started about 9,000 years ago, because wild wheat doesn't grow there at all, but the goat grass does. So one of the problems with bread wheat is that there's a lack of the genes from the goat grass for quality and for disease resistance. So one modern phenomenon has been to repeat that rare maybe one or a few times cross between goat grass and Emma deliberately to increase the biodiversity of bread wheat. Now, with bread wheat, one of the problems is there's been a lot of shuttle breeding to make sure that varieties produced by the International Wheat and Rice Research Station are adapted to a range of different climatic conditions. And one of the problems, I think, is that a lot of countries have selected similar parents for crossing programs. And that may be an issue, but also another issue has been the development of very virulent strains of stem rust and leaf rust. And so there is a need to tackle this with multigenic resistance, because at the moment, as with a lot of crops, cereals don't last very long and then they are superseded because of lack of disease resistance. So there are different ways of doing this. You can actually stack genes into the crop. You can do this by conventional breeding or by obviously using GM technology, if it's allowable to use. Another approach, which is very appropriate for organic production, is the development of populations of wheat. It's a very interesting approach developed by in the UK by Martin Wolf, who was at Wakeland's Agroforestry place in Suffolk, where he got John Innes to cross the best, highest yielding wheat varieties of the last 50 years and the best bread making varieties. And from that, if you like, improved population, the populations were distributed initially to Oxfordshire and Poland. And so what happened was that the varieties developed into a sort of, if you like, a modern day landrace, shaped by environmental conditions and by that of the farmer. And they after 4 years, they tried the Oxfordshire population in Poland. Most of them were wiped out, just showing you that in 4 years, the population in Poland had changed quite a bit because of the colder winter conditions. Moving on. So potatoes are very interesting. In the Andes, obviously, from a cultural standpoint, they're really important. But when you look at the FAO statistics, in fact, they don't really feature very highly in terms of Peru's caloric staples. There are other things that in the lower lying areas that are grown, rice for noodles and some wheat as well. But in the Andes, in terms of biodiversity, it's fascinating because they are grown as mixtures of varieties in the fields and sometimes with other tuberous crops as well. And it must be partly for pest and disease resistance as well, and to stop crop failure. There's a gender role in terms of sorting the varieties out at the end of harvest. The women play a role sorting them out by variety. By contrast, what's been happening is that in the world, diets have been changing. So although potatoes have been important since they were introduced in Europe, for example, there's been some decline in consumption. But it's been growing particularly in places like Africa. Now, rather like wheat, there are major problems with disease. One of the most expensive diseases in the world is late blight. And a similar approach has been used to wheat breeding. For example, in Holland, there has been two approaches. One is a GM approach where they've been stacking genes in potatoes against late blight. And then about 11 years, well, the Dutch government granted an organic breeding initiative 11 years of funding, which is fantastic. It just doesn't happen in the UK. To have that length of time is really what you need for a breeding program. And they had basically an open book breeding program with all the private companies and institutions, and also involved farmers in the selection process. And they also harnessed genetic technology at the beginning in terms of screening parents for desired genes. And then the people at Wageningen University created the original crosses, which were then later on trialed and assessed on farm. So there's two approaches. It's been really successful. The organic potatoes, what's happened is that there's been some of the supermarkets have come along and said, we don't want to use copper anymore on organic potatoes. And because of this 11-year program, which has been now repeated for another 11 years, they're able to say, well, we have got potatoes for organic production that would meet your needs. So it's kind of an interesting story there. With bananas, there's, I think it's, if I get this right, there's 12% which is exported and the rest are eaten in country. There's a whole diversity of different forms of bananas which have travelled with people around the world and adapted to their local conditions. And they meet a whole variety of different needs and cooking properties. For example, steamed banana matuki is the same as food in Uganda. But the export bananas, that's a different story. That used to be Gros Michel before the Second World War. And then there was a disease called Panama disease, which affected them and killed them off because they were large monocultures. So Gros Michel was replaced by Cavendish, and that's been fine up to recently. But now a new strain of Panama disease has been starting to kill off Cavendish bananas. This is a major issue. The whole supply chain is geared up for this one banana. It's not really very easy to change to another banana. There's been a lot of effort to try and breed other bananas to be replacement for Cavendish. And banana breeding is very slow and it's really difficult, and it's been generally unsuccessful. So the only choices really so far have been actually to select mutants, sports of Cavendish that are resistant to Panama race 4, or in Australia, for example, there's some GM work to try and introduce some resistance to the disease. So it's not a brilliant solution in a way, because we are still reliant on one variety as a monoculture for a lot of our bananas. Moving on. So the problem is there's a lot of food that is cheap, and it's causing a lot of problems from a health standpoint in different parts of the world, because cheap, highly processed food rich in sugar and fat isn't cheap, in that it has a huge cost on health. And there's a very interesting example in Micronesia, in the federal state of Micronesia, and particularly in Ponape, where there's been a effort to reconnect people with their local food and cooking, for example. It's been a very clever initiative. It's called Go Local, and it's involved a lot of social science effort, including using banana bingo to try and reconnect people with there are 40 varieties of local bananas, which one of the problems is thinking about this disconnect between local people and their food. The locals were told by experts that the bananas were only fit for pig food. And yet some of them are, like carrots, the banana on the stamp, are rich sources of carotenoids. So one of the other efforts that they've been doing is to try and connect people through telly, soap operas, but also stamps to advise mothers on weaning foods for babies. So the other things that they're trying to reconnect people with is giant swamp taro and fish, which is things that they used to do before the Second World War, and telly and everything else came along. And they have bumper stickers on their cars and all sorts of things. But anyway, the point is that you cannot have an effort like this as a one-off. You have to keep at it. And Lois Engelberger did do that. She was working at it 24/7 when she was involved in it. Next. Okay, so one of the ways to protect biodiversity and underutilized crops is actually to find a market for them. So there've been various initiatives in the Andes, and particularly in Africa, to raise awareness of traditional crops, which have been, haven't had very much money put into them. So there's a scheme in Kenya, which was incredibly successful, where they got, well, farmers, they encouraged them to grow leafy veg, some of which we would know as garden flowers, actually, which then were supplied into local supermarkets. And after 11 years, I think, you know, these a lot of these crops are just continuing, basically. It's been successful without any other funding. In the Andes, there has been some effort with some of the underutilized crops, which have been suppressed, if you like, because of maybe the conquistadors who suppressed some of the Andean crops at that stage. But they are superfoods in some cases. And the, for example, the canna at the bottom, it's actually more important in Vietnam than, although it's a minor crop there, than it is in Peru, because of its giant starch granules to make noodles. So there's a lot of potential. There's some which are suitable for diabetics, which have found a market in America, but they haven't in Europe because until recently, because of legislation which is designed to stop novel foods coming into Europe, which seems a bit bureaucratic, actually. It has now come in. There's been efforts to try and get it available in Europe. So the other thing that's happened is that to try and up the game for these underutilized crops, one of the things is to, as well as applying conventional breeding methods, is to use modern genetic techniques. So the African Orphan Crop Consortium was started by Howard Shapiro, originally, who's agronomist from Mars. When he got cocoa from Africa, he got the genetic sequence of cocoa to help with the crop there. And he was talking to, I think, people from the UN about other issues. And there's all these minor crops, some of which we've already seen in the last slide, with amazing nutritional properties that are well adapted rather than things that are introduced that don't grow particularly well. Things like baobab, for example. So anyway, the African Orphan Crop Consortium has got a list of 101 crops. I think it's a movable feast in some way, which they're actually working on to do with this. One of the problems with doing the assessment of biodiversity is that sometimes they do things on, for example, baobab, which are in different parts of Africa, and then they go back to try and find the tree and it's not there anymore. So that's an issue, is actually conserving the original trees. Right, towards reunification, can food production, farming, and ecology be friends? So this is something that I heard from Pablo Ezeguera, who was what was before, I think he's retired now, a social scientist at Biodiversity International, about the Satayama initiative. So now I think it's got UN backing. It's the International Association for Support of the Satayama initiative. So the whole idea, and Satayama is a place in Japan, the whole idea is that you have this link between ecology and food production and livelihoods in the landscape. Now, this works with mountainous areas, and so there's a link between different mountainous areas. But I think the approach is quite appropriate for other sort of geographical locations. I know from reading information from IRRI and other CG centres, that they are, you can see some of the research is about the landscape around, it's not just about rice, for example. The photograph on the right is from Luzon, from the famous UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is the rice terraces in the north of Luzon. It just is of interest in that this need for connectivity is, and the problems of it are highlighted by this landscape. So this is a rice landscape. It's quite cool. The problems are the Philippines are hit by tornadoes, and there's a lot of flooding. It's made worse by the fact that there's been a lot of illegal logging. So the illegal logging causes more rain runoff and it destroys the terraces. Now, the farmers looking after the terraces have to mend them. Now, the problem is that they have one rice crop a year. They're trying to encourage them to grow more than one crop a year, up to 2 crops, and they do also produce fish. But the problem is, because it's not very profitable, the young people are actually leaving the landscape. So you can see how these 3 things are connected, how you've got to try and improve all 3 elements, not just a case of improving the crop, it's the whole thing. Next, okay, so we're looking at mimicking forest in a way, a multi-layer forest. And this is an example from a Swiss researcher called Ernst Gotsch, which is life in syntropy. There are some other examples, actually, I've been to see in the temperate world, but it's basically a system where you're growing multi-layers of cropping, including a ground layer. And this is in Brazil. So it mimics the biodiversity that you might have in forests, and also diversifies production for farmers. So this is going back to Turkey again, and it's just an example of a problem and an example of something that was developed as a possible solution. So Turkey, in Turkey, they harvest about 56 million orchid tubers from the wild a year, and there's mucilage in the tuber which is used for things like ice cream. It has a very a great mouthfeel, but unfortunately it's not sustainable. The orchids are harvested from the wild in flower. One of the problems when thinking about change is how what will the people who are involved in the harvesting do as an alternative livelihood? So that needs considering. One initiative on the right is to do snowdrops. So a lot of snowdrops are harvested from the wild and then they're sent to Holland, where they're grown on. Now, one other approach to this was to get villages involved in farming them. So obviously the original stock came from the wild, but they were then grown up and multiplied. So when I was at Eden, we were interested in seeing if we could market some of the things that were grown from the wild. There are problems though, and these are really difficult to do with quality control, in that sometimes the snowdrops were mixed species. And secondly, bureaucracy, the layers of bureaucracy unengaged with the whole process of conservation or what have you. The problem there was that the bulbs went to a central warehouse and then they were shipped out from there. And it wasn't terribly clear if it was the same bulbs that went in that came out, because on one occasion, something like 160,000 bulbs went out in and 180,000 came out. So it's obviously clear that they weren't really taking care of the stock, really, of where they came from. Right, okay, so another very successful approach in Africa from the World Agroforestry Centre is where you engage farmers in propagating fruit and nut trees that are from the wild forest and growing them on their farmland. So it's a way of conserving and utilising the varieties or things that they've selected that are of improved yield. So the groups of farmers were trained at regional centres in propagation, and they worked as teams to learn how to do this. It was incredibly successful, and the whole programme running through NGOs was run out right across the country. One of the advantages was that farmers in some parts were taught to add value to the product, so they made a lot more money, or some of them made money from selling the plants that they'd selected and propagated. Obviously, if we're thinking about trees, there's some advantages from an environmental standpoint. There's obviously a lot of focus on carbon sequestration, and the fact that in agroforestry, they complement the crops that are growing around them, because their root systems are below the level of the crops. But another thing that Peter Bunyard in Cornwall has championed, which came from, I think, Russian or Eastern European research, is to do with the biotic pump, the value of rainfall which generated from forests. And he's looking at the Amazon in particular. So his view is that if the Amazon was cut down, it would have much more significant effect on the decline in rainfall for surrounding crops. Even in the North American breadbasket, you could have greater drought because the biotic pump would be broken. Another factor to consider, whether it be productive trees or ornamental trees, obviously there's been a focus on propagating trees from your environs that are local. But bearing in mind climate change, there's another strategy, which is to propagate trees from areas where your climate is likely to be in the future. And basically, some work went on with ash trees, where the research found that trees from south of France were actually adapted to the north of Aberdeen, just showing how climatic factors are changing, but trees aren't able to move that quickly. Another issue in the Mediterranean is with grazing. You know, partly where you get overgrazing, it might be the animal's fault, but it's also humans' fault in terms of too high a stocking level. But you can use animals very cleverly to increase biodiversity in the landscape. So, for example, Iberian pigs at low density increase the biodiversity of the ground layer in cork forests. And then the other example is Dario Novellino, again, in the village that he lives in Italy, with his fellow villagers. They've converted parts of this sort of preserved location, which is mainly down to grass, into a biodiverse, rich habitat of shrubs by using goats and cattle and donkeys, but a low density grazing. So it's actually improved the biodiversity of the habitat there. Now, one of the issues with increasing population and expanding settlements is that we're getting a bit close, not only with our livestock, but also with wild animals. So there is this danger of zoonosis. An example is in Vietnam, when I was traveling around, I could see wild ducks alongside managed flocks of ducks, and there has been problems with bird flu passing from the wild ducks to the domesticated ducks. They have a policy to vaccinate the domesticated ducks, but I'm not sure. I would like to know if it was completely taken up by people. Wherever you go there in the countryside, not in the towns, you do see livestock for sale on the roadsides, sometimes even rats from the rice paddies, for example, in cages, but more commonly it's ducks and chickens. So, considering farm biodiversity initiatives, obviously we've touched on agroforestry. There's different forms of agroforestry that can be practiced. As mentioned, it provides habitat for pest control, reducing wind and the effect of things like snow. But also when considering breeding and selection of crops, you can skew your breeding according to different objectives. So maybe there's a way of looking at this in a different way and looking at competition against weeds, which you would do if you were looking at organic crop breeding, ways of competing with other crops if you're looking at mixed cropping, and also as well as pest and disease resistance and tolerance, for example, in the crops, and taste, which is something that obviously in organic, small scale organic vegetable production comes more to the fore. The bottom picture on the right is to do with regenerative agriculture, and it's really from a film about the pioneer of this in Japan, Masanobu Fukuoka, who wrote The One Straw Revolution, where he was actually using seed of the next crop, which was encased in clay, that was sown in the previous crop as it was coming to maturity. So the next crop was actually developing before harvest as a small crop at the base of it. And this is part of the thing of not disturbing the soil, for example. And then ultimately rewilding, which is actually really gently using livestock to help the development of a natural habitat, or a natural habitat according to how you stock it. Well, I think one of the things that one has to be aware of is the need to have all these three things. So the ecological issues, the food production issues, but also livelihood issues, and also to consider, well, how much do we need to produce if the world is increasing? Obviously, one of the issues is to do with food waste, and we don't want to do that, or overconsumption. But it's actually, with rewilding, are we looking at land sparing? Does this mean that this is a complement to other people who are actually growing food more intensely on less land? And is that right? One of the final thoughts is going back to Rebecca Hoskin, where she is aware that there's problems with language, and the fact that the way that we think about things is governed by the way things are written, and that we're either dominating landscapes, even by the words, even conservationists are using, or we are sort of trying to champion landscapes. I think all this needs to be done in harmony, obviously. I mean, particularly in the UK, where so much, we don't really have that much wild landscape which is untouched by humans. Very, very little. There are some examples, but at least 70% of the land here is actually under farming practices. So we just have to see if we can develop things which are in harmony for the three elements that I've been talking about. And obviously I know that there's some work on the ELM scheme at the moment, these test cases. But I think one of the problems is that you have different groups of people with different views. And I think actually considering the three things together is actually it's overlooked, basically, considering the three elements. It's either just a conservation or an ecology issue, or it's a food production issue. So, and actually thinking about people's livelihoods, they all need to be thought of together. And that's where I'm going to conclude.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Andrew. If you just bear with us one sec.
Okay.
Okay. Just having a look at the chat screen here, folks. We've got no questions stacked up there. Has anybody got any particular questions that they would like to ask of the speakers tonight?
I could maybe chip in with a little bit of background just for the people in the meeting at the moment. Andrew and I first met in the 1980s, when we were the first hybrid wheat producers in the UK. So we've both been used to being at the front of some of these issues. And that was a very clever way of producing crops by so-called crop contraceptives, where the pollinators were coated, and the female plants, because normally cereal plants are inbreeding, gaped for more pollen, and it didn't work particularly well because of chemical difficulties, and Royal Dutch Shell were involved. But it shows that even then, 40 years ago, the thought was that we need to be going in a different way to help these things along. So there's a resource out there of people wanting to deal with this, and hopefully pushing from the general population will now result in a lot of ideas that have been canned over the years being brought forward.
Yeah, I suppose that was one of the things that struck me, Cliff, was having a bit of a scan at some of the stories in the papers this week. What will be the drivers for change around this? Will it be consumers demanding more diverse food products? Will it be changes in the likes of the Common Agricultural Policy to stop subsidising bigger farmers over smaller farmers? Any ideas where the push might come from?
Well, I think it's going to be health that will determine all this in the end. I mean, particularly in this region, we're actually in a food poverty region and a health poverty region, but completely different food poverty than the one that I deal with, say, in Africa. We waste our food and we eat all the wrong stuff. The African populations just simply don't have enough. And they're being encouraged to grow the bad stuff now. But if you look at the cost to our health service, which I think all the population care about, the National Health Service and the strain it's been under, if we can get our diets right, eat a better and more wholesome variety of food, we will be healthier, and we will immediately take strain off the health service. And it's been interesting that everybody's starting to think now about their immune systems for the first time for a long while, and the fact that our diets have just become so concentrated. That's certainly affected our immune systems. The more you eat of non-natural foods, the bigger the problem gets.
Yeah,
the processing that causes most of the problems. So I think it'll be our health that'll drive it more than anything else ultimately, if everybody wakes up.
Yeah,
we are in a very interesting period because obviously these environmental land management scheme concepts have gone out to test. Basically, we don't, I think there's still some information. It's not clear how this is all going to pan out. But the whole payment scheme is changing after we've left the Common Agricultural Policy. So there's actually much more of a focus on environmental payments, and then there's all sorts of things. I mean, what will happen with farming? Are they going to encourage older farmers to leave? I don't really know. And then there's the issue that we have to really connect with people to trade with. And obviously, as we've seen in the last week, there's some concern about what will happen with upland farmers, with zero tariffs if they come in with Australia in 15 years, because upland farmers have another role to play. It's not, I mean, obviously they're struggling to survive, but their livestock is actually there to manage the habitats, basically. Yeah. So, for example, in Snowdonia, it's not just for production, it's actually to manage the landscape.
Okay.
So,
yeah. Okay, just looking around, if I want to say, I've got no more questions coming in. You may be aware, Clive is still technically logged in with us, but he's actually also trying to manage a little bit of parish council business tonight. I think he's pushing some sustainable development goals towards his local parish council. Yes. So Clive has asked me just to assist him by closing down the session. So I suppose first and foremost, if I could thank Andrew and Cliff for the presentation tonight. As always, like to think I'm reasonably well informed on these things, and then I come to these presentations and realise I haven't even scratched the surface of many of the issues. So thank you very much for the insight that you've given us into this tonight on behalf of the group and the participants.
Okay.
Just in terms of closing, next month's seminar is going to be on June the 29th. At that one, we have Professor Derek Ward, who is the Director of Public Health for Lincolnshire, will be coming to talk along. And it's interesting what you just said there about the drivers for change being our health. Professor Ward will be talking about healthy lives and well-being. So there's quite a nice little bit of join up between the various seminars. So Andrew and Cliff, again, thank you very much on behalf of the group and the participants tonight. And to everyone, thank you very much for your attendance. Have a good evening.
Thanks
Take care, everyone.
Bye.